You teeter on the edge of an abyss. Your survival depends on the choices you make. They will be as a compass, guiding you through the unknown. Will you find the path to salvation, or be lost in the darkness forever? Let me speak plainly. You're about to make some difficult decisions. Decisions that will affect the lives of others. How those decisions play out will become clear over time. I expect you're wondering who I am and where you are. I am the curator, the custodian of tales. My purpose is to keep a record of everything you do, every decision or mistake you make. This is my repository. It is filled with untold stories. Stories about friends and enemies, loyalty and betrayal, life and death. Understand that I am not here to help you. Although I have been known to bend the rules from time to time. To descend into the unknown alone is extremely brave. Or extremely foolish. Perhaps there is more to you than meets the eye. Let me give you a few words of advice. Throughout the story, you will encounter certain pictures which allude to possible outcomes. I suggest you pay attention to their meaning. It could foreshadow a future best avoided. But alas, sands of time have run out for us. We'll meet again soon to see how you fared. Or failed.
Thank you, Mr. Curator, for your lovely, albeit foreboding, introduction. Hello, and welcome to the Archaeology of Horror, how horror video games contribute to ArchaeoGaming. My name is Bryandra Owen. I'm a full-time senior archaeologist for a CRM firm and a part-time ArchaeoGamer. When I'm not out doing archaeology in the real world, Thursday evenings I stream games from the Tomb Raider franchise, and Friday evenings are what I like to call Fright Night Fridays, where I play horror games. My love of horror is second only to my love of archaeology. It's almost ingrained into my very being, much like archaeology is. Catching our local version of Elvira, who was appropriately named Count Coolrider, every Saturday night for horror movies was one of the main pastimes I enjoyed with my mom as a kid. While her dad, my grandfather, instilled in me a love of and appreciation of archaeology and history, my mom contributed to my love and appreciation of horror. As the content warning described at the beginning, this presentation will be focusing on the horror genre, which will mean including game footage and images that will likely be frightening, disturbing, and unpleasant. I've done my best to avoid graphic content, as many horror games depict very graphic violence and gore. I have intentionally left out any depiction of this violence, gore, and anything that could be potentially trauma-triggering. However, some examples may contain the digital depiction of human skeletal remains. This presentation will be divided into 3 parts: the introduction, the representation of archaeology in horror, and the utilization of ArchaeoGaming in horror-driven virtual spaces. The introduction will cover key terms and concepts that will be relevant to my discussion. The representation of archaeology and horror will be just that. I'll be discussing and providing examples of how the horror genre within digital media, such as video games, uses archaeological tropes to drive game world narratives or lore. The utilization of ArchaeoGaming in horror-driven virtual spaces will look at how, as archaeologists, we can use the immaterial landscapes and environments of horror video games to study object usage, material communication, and cultural imprints of the contemporary natural world. Before we dive into things, it's important that I cover the terminology and key concepts that will be critical to my discussion. Some of you may be familiar with these terms and concepts already. First, I need to establish what horror is and what ArchaeoGaming is. Second, I will address the key concepts. The concepts that are important to this discussion include archives of horror, archaeological tropes, narrative archaeology, immaterial environments and objects, material-based communication, and finally dark heritage and dark tourism. So, what constitutes horror? The genre is generally marked by things designed to elicit fear. Horror is meant to affect the audience in a way that causes fear, visceral disgust, and revulsion. It can include, but is certainly not limited to, abnormal, threatening monsters that can be either supernatural or natural entities, human or non-human, for example, Cthulhu versus Michael Myers. It is also not limited to its own genre. Horror can exist as a subgenre or an element of other genres, such as adventure, comedy, fantasy, and sci-fi. What makes horror effective is its ability to draw out the vulnerabilities within the human mind. This is why horror is not limited to just monsters, ghosts, and serial killers. It can also be about and reflect psychological traumas. This is what makes horror very broad, because what is considered horrifying will vary person to person and community to community. Symbols of horror are not going to be the same across all social and cultural groups. From here, we step into what ArchaeoGaming is. ArchaeoGaming is the intersection of archaeology and gaming. This includes looking at games as they exist in the natural material world as archaeology and cultural items, as well as looking within the games themselves as having their own cultural environments and resources. The games this field studies include digital games, which are your video or computer games, and tabletop games, such as role-playing games, card games, and board games. In ArchaeoGaming, all games are considered archaeological sites, landscapes, and artifacts. All game spaces within video games are considered to have their own digital environments with their own material culture. The games themselves do not necessarily have to do with archaeology or history. Pac-Man is just as important as an ArchaeoGaming subject as Tomb Raider. Key concepts will be described and defined with examples in the following slides. This is to make it easier for everyone to follow and understand what exactly I'm talking about. Archives of horror. These are repositories of symbols and rituals that generate fear. They can be created visually and artistically and curated by society and culture. It is difficult to provide a comprehensive archive of what is horrific and what is not, because the notion of horror encompasses multiple forms and meanings across the world. For this reason, archives of horror must be dynamic and provide information on the interactions between old and new symbols, past and present, and our positioning within these interactions. There are two types of archives, external and internal. External, or collective, archives are the symbols and beliefs recognized and referenced as horrific by the society or culture. Examples of this would include Catholicism or Christianity fearing Satan or demons, cultural traditions or practices fearing but respecting the dead, and a fear of the unknown or other. These are the symbols, places, or things that our society or culture tells us to fear. Internal or private archives are the personal symbols and values which, entertained in the human mind, differentiate individuals from one another. Examples of this would include personal phobias, such as having a fear of dolls or having a fear of blood. Personal trauma can make individuals fear certain places, people, animals, or things, such as fearing dogs after being attacked by one as a child. These are the symbols, places, or things that we personally, from life experience, fear, and it isn't always necessarily influenced by external archives, but it certainly can be. The two screenshots on the left are taken from the Dark Pictures Anthology, House of Ashes by Supermassive Games, and are examples of external archives of horror. The two screenshots on the right are taken from The Town of Light by LKA, and are examples of internal archives of horror. Top left is a screenshot of a complete solar eclipse. This natural phenomenon can be considered an external archive of horror because certain societies and cultures view solar eclipses as omens. It is often utilized in pop culture as signaling the fruition of an apocalyptic prophecy. Bottom right is a screenshot of a statue of the Syrian god Pazuzu. To the culture he belongs to, Pazuzu was the demon god of the wind. While scary looking, he was a revered god. However, to Western cultures and religions, Pazuzu is not a god, but a representative of Satan. The movie buffs here will recognize Pazuzu as being the demon from the quintessential horror movie of all time, The Exorcist. Top right is a screenshot of a porcelain doll. This is an example of an internal archive. I, personally, find dolls extremely creepy, and I don't like them. However, you may view them as just dolls. Nothing creepy or malicious about them. It's a toy. Bottom right is a screenshot of medical diagrams and human anatomy posters. This is another example of an internal archive. Also, that creepy doll's face. While I find dolls to be creepy, the inside of the human body doesn't really bother me. However, the depiction of internal organs and dissected body parts may make some folks queasy. Dark heritage are locations and places that are associated with death and human suffering, either in the distant or recent past. This includes, but is not limited to, Nazi concentration camps, U.S. Japanese internment camps, asylums or hospitals, prisons, and residential schools. This can also include places one would not typically associate with trauma, but because of a single tragic event, it is forever associated with death and human suffering, such as a house where murders took place, or, in the case of the U.S., places where mass shootings have taken place. Dark tourism is the presentation and consumption, by visitors, of real and commodified death and disaster sites. This is tourism of dark heritage. One of many critiques of dark tourism is that it is a matter of perspective and privilege. A dark tourist who has a connection to a dark heritage site will have a more emotionally fueled experience versus the dark tourist who has no cultural connection to the site at all. Both of these screenshots were taken from the video game The Town of Light. The picture on the left is the outside of the Volterra Asylum. The picture on the right is a decaying hallway within the Volterra Asylum. This would be considered a dark heritage site, and the player would be considered a dark tourist. Archaeological tropes. So this is an easy one. Everyone pretty much should know what constitutes an archaeological trope. This is the use of archaeology as a plot device, or using an archaeologist as an archetypal character. Archaeological tropes basically are using the finding of a specific artifact, a civilization, and using that as a jumping off point for the rest of the story. Your archaeologists as archetypal characters are like your Indiana Jones or your Lara Croft, where they're these badass, mercenary type of characters that are out to save the world from the bad guys that want to use the artifacts for bad and terrible things. You also have archaeologists that are the villain trope as well. These are the bad guys that just want the power and the glory of finding the artifact and using its power for nefarious things. How this trope gets utilized in horror, and is actually the pretty common use of it, is archaeologists or looters going and removing an artifact of some kind that is basically a barrier between our world and a supernatural being. This can translate to a curse of some kind, such as the mummy, where an undead creature is unleashed upon the world, or this could also be more grandiose consequences, such as unleashing a god of some kind, or also unleashing a type of disaster scenario that results in a apocalyptic series of events. Both of these screenshots were taken from the Dark Picture Anthology, House of Ashes. The picture on the left is of 2 of the 5 playable characters descending into the throne room chamber of an Assyrian temple. The picture on the right is showing the character Rachel finding and commenting on an old photograph she finds among the equipment left inside the chamber. She states that it is a photograph of a group of archaeologists from 1946. Immaterial places or environments refer to the spaces within video games and virtual worlds. These are the landscapes and areas the characters of the game inhabit and the world the player moves through and interacts with. Similarly, immaterial objects are the things and items within a digital immaterial place. These objects can serve multiple functions and purposes, including providing necessary aids to in-game mechanics or being merely a means to convey information to the player. Both of these screenshots were taken from the game Phasmophobia by Kinetic Games. The picture on the left is the immaterial environment of what is called the Ghost Room. This room is found using immaterial objects such as a thermometer. The picture on the right is of a special immaterial object known as a cursed object. These objects can be utilized within the game at a degree of risk to the player, but also should be documented in-game to achieve extra points. In digital media, such as video games, narrative archaeology refers to the player becoming the explorer, or in this case, the archaeologist, who must piece together dissociated knowledge or lore from in-game objects and documents. This can include hidden documents that can be found in some games, such as a file in Resident Evil 2 that documents Raccoon City Police Department's response to the zombie outbreak, or a patient readmission file from the Town of Light. These 2 documents provide additional history and lore to the main narrative that the player would not otherwise know if they had not explored their environment. The screenshot on the left was taken from the remake of Resident Evil 2 by Capcom. It shows the in-game document from the Raccoon City Police Department that covers RPD's response to the zombie outbreak leading up to the beginning of the game. The screenshot on the right was taken from the Town of Light and shows an in-game document. This document is the aforementioned patient readmission form to the Volterra Asylum. Both of these in-game documents provide additional backstory and history that the player would not have knowledge of unless they explicitly took the time to explore the environment. Material-based communication is how the game creators communicate information to the player. In video games, for example, most communication is exclusively material-based and is one-way. It is an element within the game to provide the player with information that will help them successfully navigate and survive within the game world. Material-based communication can be in material objects and narrative archaeology. Both of these screenshots were taken from the remake of Resident Evil 2. They show an in-game document placed by the developers to convey information to the player. This specific document explains how the player can use gunpowder to make ammo, a valuable resource and necessary to the player's survival in the game. Now that we've gotten the terms and key concepts out of the way, the boring stuff, as it were, now it's time for some fun. Here's the representation of archaeology in horror.
September the 24th, 1945. When Lady Bradshaw summons you, you go. Mary and I were bound for our honeymoon, but the chance to dine with one of Britain's finest antiquarians was too great for us to miss. When we met, Bradshaw wore a brooch that caught Mary's eye. A Sumerian relic recovered from a dig site in the Hashemite kingdom of Iraq. After dinner, she showed us another find from the same site, a gold cuneiform tablet. She called it the final puzzle piece in her life's work, a map that pinpoints the tomb of Alexander the Great. If she's right, the tomb lies somewhere on the border of Iraq. Lady Bradshaw wants us to lead her expedition. I realize now that our honeymoon will take place in a dusty dig site in the Zagros Mountains. 9 p.m. Something unholy has happened. As I sat with my wife, I noticed something in her hand. Lady Bradshaw's brooch. She must have pulled it from her shirt when she grabbed at her. Turning it over, I noticed that it looked like one of the creatures we'd exhumed from the cocoons. Were these the demons Mary had spoken about? Had Bradshaw known all along what we'd find down here? Then Mary's corpse moved. It was not my wife. It was something inhuman. It leapt at me, and only the bars of the cell spared me from its fury. First of January, 1947, 1 a.m. The saboteur has struck again, sealing us in here. We are hopelessly trapped with those things. All around us, they shriek from the darkness. Crow has set up his machine gun, pointed towards the catacombs. Mary was right. We cannot fight that which does not live. There is only one option now. Bring the whole damn temple down on them. Even if it means bringing it down on our own heads. They cannot be allowed out of here. The bones of this temple are drenched in blood. We have set foot on an uncharted shore and roused something ancient and wicked. A blasphemy that comes in indescribable shapes and forms. For eons we lived as children in this world, unaware of the horrors that slumber beneath our feet. Now we have blindly thrown open the gates to madness. I fear being taken, but I must do what I must. We must seal this place for eternity, for all mankind. Mary, I'm sorry.
That game footage was taken from the Dark Pictures Anthology, House of Ashes. The third installment in the Dark Pictures Anthology game series by Supermassive games. These were flashback clips that you obtain by finding journal entries from the archaeologists that excavated and explored the temple that the characters are currently inside of. Now, these are only certain parts of the journal. There are other parts, which is why the clips are kind of disjointed. They're not very cohesive. I did this because A, I wanted to save on time, B, it gives you guys a reason to go play the game, which I highly recommend, and C, to get to the point. It starts out as this newly wedded couple being approached by a wealthy benefactor who wants to go dig up a temple in Iraq. And they happily go along, and they think they're on this grand adventure, and they're going to find all this marvelous treasure. And it turns out there was something really bad hanging out down there inside this temple. And because they're responsible for letting it out, they take it upon themselves to try to keep it in. This brings us to the third part of this presentation and the last part of this presentation, the utilization of ArchaeoGaming in horror-driven virtual spaces. Here we have examples of achievements that you can actually obtain by doing certain things within these horror survival video games. The first one is an achievement from the Dark Pictures Anthology, House of Ashes. This is an achievement you get by finding all of Randolph Hodginson's journal entries. These are the entries from the archaeologist that tells the story of the 1940s expedition to Iraq and uncovering this temple and the deadly secret within. If you diligently explore your environment in this game, you can find these pages and get the full story of the lore and history of this site, of this nightmare that you've uncovered. And then you get rewarded for it as a player. The second achievements listed here are both from Resident Evil 2, the remake by Capcom. These are achievements you get by finding additional information throughout the game. So Treasure Hunter is finding rolls of film that you have to develop. And when you develop them, there'll be pictures of codes or other things that help you find hidden items, and these items can be additional ammo, extra health herbs, or other things that might come in handy for your survival in the game. Lore Explorer is slightly different because rather than being an achievement for finding objects that you can use and that serve a purpose, these are all just the in-game documents that explain the history and the lore that Capcom had created with Resident Evil, the series. So these will be documents like explaining how Raccoon City Police dealt with the outbreak of the zombie virus. It'll explain certain characters' motivations. It'll be notes from certain characters in the game about things that they're doing, having to deal with, and there'll also be, documentation from Umbrella, which is the corporation that created the T-virus that basically caused the zombie outbreak in Raccoon City. So these are just examples. Other games have similar achievements, and these are basically ways that the game rewards players for fully exploring the immaterial environment of the game, of basically playing archaeologist by trying to dig up information based on the things that they're finding and looking at. Now, obviously, you can completely blow through these games and speedrun them and only worry about finding the items that are going to help you accomplish what you need to accomplish in the game and help you survive. But I feel that, and obviously developers feel, that in doing so, you're losing out on a deeper experience of the game. You're not experiencing it in the same way that the developer wants you to experience it. So for the purposes of the rest of this presentation, I'm continuing to use House of Ashes. This is an artifact. This is a premonition picture. So you find these and they give you glimpses into the future to help you make it through the rest of the game, to make decisions that could potentially save your character or kill them. There are also things like this where you inspect them and get additional information.
We are cursed by our own actions. Why did your king create the Same story that history has taught us. For gold, for glory, for greed.
So, for things like this, you can overlook them, but by doing so, you then miss background and history about the story.
This looks like archaeological gear.
So this is where the characters are noticing that
Hey, we can use those lamps.
the immaterial objects
Lights got the
within
marine
this
stores.
space are not just ancient, they're more modern.
Do you think that still works?
And they're realizing this is part of an archaeological
It'll work.
expedition
Just needs gas.
that meant to uncover
You find
these
some.
ruins. So, you explore the area and engage in ArchaeoGaming to see what you can find out. And here you find an in-game object that's basically just a secret.
Somewhere.
It serves no purpose other than to provide you with lore and history and context.
You regretting not calling for additional air support yet?
So in this space, as you explore, you will find several items much like that. Here is our first journal entry.
This place is starting to make me feel a little uneasy.
And you can see in the space there are other objects, other artifacts, nothing that you can interact with, but it still adds and tells a story. Here you have the photograph of the expedition
What
team
happened to these guys?
providing additional information. It serves no purpose
Anything
other
important?
than to give you lore
It's
and
a
history.
photo of the archaeologists from 1946.
Board here before us. Must be another
And
way
here's
out.
another in-game document. Again, it's lore-based.
Locals were spooked by these mountains. Can't say I blame them. something this vast have remained hidden for so long?
Now, some of this lore information and documents that you find, even though you can't do anything with them, are important.
Is this something to do with bats?
They give you information
Symptoms?
that,
Characteristics, maybe?
if you are
Not exactly sure.
a player that pays attention, you can catch on to things that the characters don't catch on to.
Those chemical weapons are close, right?
And here you can see this is, if you found the other documents, you'll have context for who this is and whose remains these are. So, this game also gives us the benefit of looking at real-world culture and real-world historical events and analyzing them with the knowledge we have today. So, as you can see here, this is Jason Kolchak. He's one of the characters that's playable, and you notice on his hat here is a Remember 9/11, and these represent the towers. This becomes a focal point of his character. As you can see, one of his characteristics is intolerant. He very much believes that the Iraqi people were responsible for 9/11 and makes that known to the Iraqi character that is in this game.
Colonel, your trip?
So we're going to skip forward just a smidge, because even though this character is not playable,
Did you hear? There's a new king.
Clarice. So she's not playable, but there are things about her that are very unique to the early 2000s. This choker, for example. Anybody that was a teen or preteen in the early 2000s, that was like the jam, was to wear those. I wore them. All my friends wore them. It was a thing. So this is very iconic of that time period.
In the castle.
You'll have to excuse the noise and disorder.
So this is Saddam Hussein's palace.
Blows my mind. Only a few weeks ago, Saddam was living it up.
And there is some very interesting commentary about this.
Nice image.
If only you could see the state of this place now.
So to conclude and end off this presentation, I would have liked to have done so much more, but given time constraints, not wanting to make this file excessively large, and really there's so many things to talk about when it comes to these games, to horror, to how archaeology is represented in horror. There's a lot. I could do a whole series on this. So, you know, if there's an interest, I'll do it. Primary things to take away from this is that horror survival games give us excellent examples of narrative archaeology. As you've seen, they provide items that give us history about the game world. They give us information that helps us understand what makes the game tick, basically. What were the developers and the writers of these games looking at? What did they want to accomplish besides, just making a fun, entertaining game? They spent a lot of time working on these backstories, working on this history, and they throw these little secret items in there for us to find so we can figure that out. It also provides us examples of player-driven interaction with cultural heritage. So again, as you've seen, finding artifacts within these games that are specific to the game world. In the case of House of Ashes, you had artifacts both linked to the ancient period, having to do with Assyrian culture, and then you had things linked to a more modern, more historic age, having to do with the 1940s and the archaeologists that excavated the site. The game also presented us with a critical assessment of real-world cultural assumptions. In House of Ashes, this is presented with this game taking place at the height of the Iraqi war. So there's a lot of commentary there that we didn't really touch upon too much because that's kind of its own thing. I tried to make note of it here at the end because it is a good example of how these games can be utilized to assess our cultural assumptions. And I think it's worth noting that this game was written by somebody of Iraqi descent, and so it was very interesting to learn these things and see how that translates into the game. For further research, obviously, we want to take what we've learned as ArchaeoGamers, as archaeologists, and apply it to multiple genres. Like, we don't want to just look at adventure games. We don't want to just look at Tomb Raider or Uncharted or older games. Like, we don't want to just look at the games that were on Nintendo or Sega or Atari. We want to look at everything. There's potential in every form of game, and I think that horror specifically gives us a good opportunity to really utilize that because they add so much extra to the immaterial spaces that gives us those reflections of current social and cultural ideologies. So, again, this is just scratching the surface of this topic, scratching the surface of this genre, of these types of games. I would love to talk more about it. So, if there is an interest, I will do it. I will make more videos. I will do more things and put these out so they're out there and they exist, and it's not something that I just do once a year for the convention. And I'm going to apologize now because I missed out on Tomb Raider, and I know a lot of people were really looking forward to that, myself included. I just couldn't get in what I needed to get in to get that done. I will still do it. I will still post it online. It just unfortunately could not be premiered during the con, and I apologize for that. But that being said, love to do more of these, and I hope you guys like it. Thank you so much.